So let's kind of look at the microflora of ears and eyes, and just typical microflora that you may find residing in certain areas of the body. So like I said, we have a microflora that surround our ears as well as our eyes. Now, there are certain components to these particular organs that are actually free of microorganisms. And for the ear, that's going to be the middle ear as well as the inner ear. For the outer ear and the auditory canal, they are colonized by the same microscopic organisms that reside on the skin. So you're likely to find Staphylococcus aureus, Staphylococcus epidermidis, you're likely to find Micrococcus luteus, those organisms that I discussed earlier. Now, there's also microorganisms that surround our eye, but our eye and our bodies are cognizant, of where certain microorganisms are, that we have developed our own defense systems against these normal flora organisms, not to the extent that we want to kill them and eradicate them, but we do want to maintain them so that we have a nice balance between our cells and then the microbial cells. So our eyes, I know many of you know this already, they are lubricated, so they have a nice moist, they provide a nice moist environment, which is very attractive to some bacteria. But our defenses that we use are going to be enzymes that are excreted whenever we cry. So there's an enzyme called lysozyme, which is secreted in our tears, and that helps to prevent bacteria and other microscopic organisms from accumulating in those areas, and kind of helps to maintain the cell cultures that exist there. There's also mucus as well as sebum. Both of these help to trap specific microorganisms and again to contain them. And this helps for other cells in the body to kind of circulate and determine, if something is in the wrong location or something, isn't growing as it should, or if something's growing too much, then your body will send out these specialized cells called macrophages that will go and kind of clean up some of the microorganisms that are trapped in the mucus or the sebum or have been washed away by the enzymes in your tears. So all of these are kind of trapping mechanisms that are defenses of the eye to help maintain the microflora that resides around the eye area. So we have microorganisms in these areas. There's not a high concentration of them, but they are still there. The next region of the body is that of the respiratory tract, and the respiratory tract consists of two parts: the upper respiratory, which consists of both the throat as well as your nasal passages, and then there's a lower respiratory, which was not as exposed to, well, it is pretty exposed to elements that are external to the body, but for the most part all these organs and structures are internal. So you have the larynx, you have the trachea, the bronchi, as well as the lungs. This is the passageway that we all rely on to breathe, but it also provides a great gateway for organisms outside the body to get into the body. And because of that, these particular structures are aligned with their own normal flora. And a lot of them kind of have colonized that area because they were among the first pioneers of microorganisms to be breathed in when you took your first breath. So things travel through the air and you breathe them in, and then you have colonization down these areas. And again, as colonization happens, if your body is not subjective to succumbing to infection from these microorganisms are doing you a lot of good, because again, they're taking up places in your body where potentially more pathogenic bacteria could reside, which could induce infection. So these primary areas, you definitely are going to have a lot of microflora colonizing. So like I said, these are typically mostly harmless bacteria, but every now and then we tend to breathe in something that can make us sick. And so, given the chance, after these guys have colonized, if you have some sort of immunocompromisation that happens, say you start to get sick in another area of your body, and so your immune defenses get a little bit weaker, that allows some of the normal flora of your respiratory tract to get a little bit stronger, or maybe that flora gets disrupted. But like I said, that also can induce illness as well as disease when given the opportunity. One thing to note about the respiratory tract is that it's a great area for a lot of individuals to kind of contain microorganisms that don't have any impact on them, or don't bring the host person any type of illness or any type of disease. But since they're residing there, and our society considers them to be, linked to eliciting disease and illness in other patients, if there's a high prevalency of that, then you're basically diagnosed as a carrier. And a carrier is somebody who has microorganisms residing as a part of their normal flora, or in their nasal cavity, on their skin. So individuals that have these type of bacteria are referred to as carriers. And a carrier is not impacted negatively by a bacteria colonizing it. However, that carrier can transmit or spread that pathogen to another individual through interaction. And once the carrier does that, then we have kind of, a threat that we have to kind of go through and track and figure out where it originated on. So there's nothing scarier than somebody being colonized by a pathogenic bacteria who doesn't even know it, because they're asymptomatic, which means that they're not expressing any symptoms. So having knowledge that carriers exist is pretty important, because they can contain very virulent pathogens, and virulent just means that they have a high chance to increase infection inside the body of those that succumb to it. So the nasal passages of an individual, or the upper respiratory tract, they typically can be great sites where you'll have a lot of what could be virulent pathogens. So they just get hosted in these areas. And then you have the carrier maybe sneeze or cough, or they do something to move that bacteria from the nasal passages or from the throat out into the air, or out onto another individual. And when that happens, that's when you can have the spread of the illness or the disease. So some examples that your book outlines are those of carriers for diphtheria, carriers for pneumonia, carriers for meningitis, or carriers for whooping cough. So people can contain these organisms that bring about these particular infections and diseases, but they are not impacted by it, mainly because they don't express any symptoms. And so without symptoms, it's hard to determine if you have an infection. Okay. The lower respiratory tract, which again consists of a lot of the pulmonary structures, such as the lungs, your bronchi, and your trachea, these typically are very free of microorganisms. That can be attributed to a lot of reasons. Either these structures are too deep in the body that these external microorganisms just aren't reaching down there. It could also be just with the abundance of oxygen that flows through that region. There's a lot of bacteria, are considered primarily to be either anaerobic or aerobic. So if you have a lot of bacteria that are mostly anaerobic, and they try to colonize down in these tubes, the oxygen could easily kill them. if they're strict anaerobic. For aerobic bacteria that are pathogenic, they could have a high chance of spreading down here as long as they're able to get down to these locations. But these structures really are just really deep in the body, so that could be a primary reason as to why they're typically free of microorganisms. We don't put any food down these areas because we use a digestive system for that, and your digestive system is not typically free of microbes. You have a lot of filtration structures that air has to pass through before it goes down the trachea and then out into the bronchi of the lungs. For instance, the air passes through your nose, where your nose has hair as well as mucus, where it can trap dust particles as well as small microorganisms. So there's defenses that help to kind of sterilize that air before it gets deep into your lung tissue. Okay, so the microflora of the oral cavity is the next region we're going to talk about. As most of you are all going to be dental hygienists, this will probably be the most pertinent of the course to you, because it really is about the oral cavity that we really want you to know about as you're working with patients and you're digging in their mouth and you're scraping plaque off their teeth and you're just so happy to do that. There's a lot of nasty bacteria that accumulate all in the oral cavity. It's a great environment because it's humid, it's moist, there's carbohydrate sources from the ingestion of food, there's protein sources also from the ingestion of food. Bacteria love glucose, and we eat a lot of it. They also love proteins in the form of peptone, and we also eat a lot of that. So anything that we put in our mouth, pretty much bacteria eat as well. So the oral cavity creates a great environment for growing different types of bacteria. And, if we don't upkeep that environment, that definitely can impact us significantly. So individuals that don't exhibit very good dental hygiene practices, they don't floss, they don't brush their teeth, they're easily subjected to tooth decay, gum disease, periodontitis. And so that's, you can get a lot of cavities, get a lot of dental caries. Your gums can be very weak and very sensitive, which means they bleed a lot, or they'll get inflamed. That all is pretty symptomatic of having gingivitis. With periodontitis, you're pretty much looking for the destruction of the bone and the breakaway of your gum tissue separating from your tooth, and your tooth separating from your bone, and then the degradation of that entire complex that holds your teeth to your maxilla as well as to your mandible. As well as the muscles in your gums, that hold your teeth in place. So all of that system just starts getting broken down when you have periodontitis. So there's a lot of also very common organisms that represent that reside in your oral cavity, and many of them kind of consist of a variety of different species of a group known as the alpha hemolytic streptococci. Alpha hemolytic typically means that when a bacteria when it finds itself in the presence of blood, it can convert the blood into kind of partial hemolysis. So if you were to grow a streptococci on like a blood agar plate, which is a medium that contains blood in it, you would see the bacteria growing on top of the plate, but the bacteria would be hydrolyzing or breaking down the red blood cells. Not completely, just partially. And when it does that, you get this kind of greening effect that occurs with it. These types of bacteria are very common to find inside your oral cavity. They're